Millionaire widower just wanted company at the party, but the nanny became the center of attention. Before we explore all the details of this incredible story, tell us where you're following us from and the time. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing, and let's embark on this journey together. The first thing she always noticed was the silence. It wasn't an empty silence, not the kind that felt hollow and abandoned. It was a heavy silence, dense with unspoken words and curated by grief. It was the silence of Leonard Whitmore's house, a sprawling minimalist structure of glass and steel that felt more like a monument to what was lost than a home for what remained. And every morning for nearly a year, Nicole Ellis had made it her mission to fill that silence, not with noise, but with warmth. It started with the small things, the scent of cinnamon and oats bubbling on the stove, a deliberate counterpoint to the sterile citrus-scented cleaner the housekeeping service used, the soft hum of a lullaby she'd sing while braiding 7-year-old Hazel's hair, the notes weaving themselves into the fabric of the quiet rooms. Nicole operated with a gentle precision, a quiet competence that Leonard, a man who built his life and career on precision, couldn't help but admire from a distance. This morning was no different. Hazel was perched on a stool at the vast kitchen island, her small legs kicking rhythmically against the polished chrome base. She was struggling with a math worksheet, a tiny furrow in her brow that was a miniature echo of her father's. "I don't get it, Nikki," she mumbled, pushing the paper away. "The numbers are all jumbled up." Nicole leaned over, her presence a soft cloud of vanilla and patience. She didn't give the answer. Instead, she pointed a steady finger at the problem. "Let's look at it like a puzzle. We have 10 cookies, right? And your 2 friends come over. If you want to be fair, how many does each person get?" Hazel's dark eyes, so much like her mother's, lit up with understanding. "Oh, like sharing." "Exactly like sharing," Nicole affirmed with a warm smile. From the doorway of his home office, Leonard watched them. He was holding a mug of black coffee, the steam coiling into the cool, conditioned air. He'd been standing there for nearly a minute, unseen. It had become a secret, treasured part of his morning ritual. He would observe the easy rapport between his daughter and her nanny, a dynamic so natural it felt like it had always existed. He saw how Hazel, who had been a ghost in this house after her mother's passing, was now vibrant and grounded. She laughed again, a full-bellied sound that the house had been starved of. It was all because of Nicole. He knew her qualifications were impeccable, her references stellar, but no resume could capture the quiet grace with which she moved through their lives, patching holes he didn't even know were there. She was serene, her dark skin glowing under the recessed lighting, her expressive eyes holding a depth that felt both wise and kind. He felt a familiar, quiet ache in his chest, a mixture of profound gratitude and a loneliness that her presence only seemed to highlight. Clearing his throat, he stepped fully into the kitchen. "Good morning." Nicole's posture straightened instantly, the easy warmth tightening into professional courtesy. "Mr. Whitmore, good morning." She never, ever slipped. In all her months here, she had maintained a flawless, impenetrable boundary. He was Mr. Whitmore. She was Nicole. It was a chasm of formality he had established himself, and now he found himself regretting its depth. "I see the math puzzle is being solved," he said, his voice smoother than he felt. "Hazel is a natural problem solver," Nicole replied, her gaze fixed on the child, deliberately not meeting his. She just needed a new perspective. He wanted to say more. He wanted to tell her that she was the new perspective, the one who had changed everything. He wanted to thank her not just for the tutoring or the healthy meals, but for giving his daughter back her childhood. Instead, the weight of their respective roles settled between them. He was the employer, she was the employee. So he just nodded. "I have a site visit this afternoon, so I may be late. Mrs. Gable will drop Hazel home from school." "Of course. I'll have her homework done and dinner started by the time you return," Nicole said, her tone efficient and reassuring. It was the tone of the perfect nanny, and for some reason it frustrated him. Later that night, long after Hazel was asleep and the house had returned to its deep-weighted silence, Nicole sat in her own small apartment across town. It was a simple, clean space, filled with second-hand books and thriving plants. It was hers. She was scrolling through her online banking app, meticulously allocating her paycheck, rent, utilities, student loan payment, a stubborn ghost from a degree she'd never used. The numbers were fine. She was stable, responsible. But her mind wasn't on the budget. It was on the way Mr. Whitmore had looked at her this morning, just for a second. Before the professional mask had slipped back into place, There was something else in his eyes, a softness, a flicker of something. Her heart did a stupid little flutter, a traitorous beat against her ribs. She pressed her lips together, annoyed with herself. "He's your boss," she thought, a firm internal reprimand, a grieving man who is grateful for your work. That is all. She couldn't afford illusions. She had built her career on being dependable, trustworthy, and invisible when necessary. An emotional entanglement was not just unprofessional, it was a form of self-sabotage. She knew her place, and it was not in the orbits of silent millionaire architects. A week later, the carefully constructed walls of her professionalism were put to the ultimate test. Nicole was wiping down the kitchen counters, the last task in her end-of-day routine. Hazel was upstairs, humming as she put her toys away. Leonard appeared in the doorway much as he had that morning, but his posture was different. He wasn't holding his coffee mug like a shield. His hands were tucked into the pockets of his tailored trousers, and he seemed hesitant. The methodical confidence he usually wore was absent, replaced by a raw, uncertain energy that immediately put her on edge. "Nicole," he began, his voice a low tenor that seemed to make the air vibrate. She turned, cloth in hand. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore?" He took a slow breath, his gaze not quite meeting hers. "There is a fundraising gala next Saturday, for the Children's Hospital." He paused, as if weighing each word. "It's an important event. I'm expected to be there." She waited, unsure where this was going. Her mind raced through possibilities. Did he need her to work late? Stay overnight? "I don't want to take a stranger," he continued, finally looking at her. The full force of his gaze was startling. "Someone who doesn't understand my family, who doesn't know Hazel." He took a small step closer. The kitchen suddenly felt tiny. "I was wondering if you would accept to go with me as my companion for the evening, and to keep an eye on Hazel, of course. She'll be there for the first hour." Nicole's mind went blank. The wet cloth dripped onto the pristine quartz countertop. Drip, drip. The sound was deafening in the silence that stretched between them. A gala. With him. The idea was absurd. A scene from a movie, not her life. It was a request that blurred every line she had so carefully drawn. He saw the hesitation, the conflict that washed over her features. He quickly added, as if to soften the blow, "You can choose any dress you want. I'll cover the cost, of course. I want you to feel comfortable, elegant." He swallowed, a barely perceptible motion. And as he said the final words, his voice dropped even lower, filled with an intensity that struck her far more than the invitation itself. "You deserve to be noticed." In that moment, she was utterly destabilized. Not by the impossible proposition, but by the quiet sincerity in his voice. It wasn't a command from a boss or a proposition from a man. It felt like a plea, and she understood with a terrifying clarity that he wasn't just asking her to a gala. He was asking her to step out of the shadows, and she was afraid she wouldn't know how to step back in. The words hung in the air between them, shimmering with a weight that felt heavier than the silence that followed. "You deserve to be noticed." It wasn't a compliment, it was a confession. Nicole felt the floor tilt beneath her feet, the solid ground of her professionalism turning to sand. Her mind, usually a fortress of logic and self-control, was in chaos. One part of her, the sensible, pragmatic part that paid her bills and remembered to water her plants, screamed danger. This was a line that, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. It was a door that could lead to heartbreak, misunderstanding, and unemployment. But another part of her, a smaller, quieter voice she had suppressed for nearly a year, whispered, what if she allowed herself for one night to be just Nicole? Not the nanny, not the employee, but the woman who felt a current of warmth in this man's presence, who saw the profound sadness behind his guarded eyes and wished she could soothe it. The invitation was a risk, but declining it felt like a risk of a different kind, a betrayal of the fragile, unspoken connection that hummed between them. The professional excuse he had offered, to keep an eye on Hazel, was the life raft she clung to. It was the perfect justification, the armor that would allow her to step onto this treacherous ground while pretending she was still on solid territory. She finally found her voice, amazed it came out as a steady, even tone. Hazel does get nervous in large crowds. It would be good for her to have a familiar face nearby. She was framing it as a duty, a simple extension of her job. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Was it disappointment? But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a smooth, relieved smile. "Excellent," Leonard said, his own voice sounding more grounded now. "It's settled then. I'll have my assistant send you the details." He retreated then, leaving her alone in the vast, silent kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs with a wild, terrifying rhythm. She had said yes. That night, in the solitude of her apartment, the reality of her decision set in. She sat on her worn sofa, her laptop open, scrolling through a high-end fashion rental app. Page after page of silks and satins, designer names she recognized from magazines she'd only ever flipped through in waiting rooms. Each dress felt like a costume for a life that wasn't hers. She felt a surge of imposter syndrome, so sharp and sudden it made her want to call him and cancel. She took a deep breath and texted her older sister, Alani. Did something crazy. Agreed to go to a work gala with my boss. Alani's reply was instantaneous. The reclusive millionaire architect boss? Nick, be careful. I will, she typed back. It's for his daughter, really. Just keeping an eye on her. The lie felt flimsy even through the screen. A dress comes with this babysitting job? Alani's skepticism was palpable. Nicole ignored the question and focused on the screen. She filtered the options, dismissing anything too revealing, too bright, too loud. She wasn't trying to be the center of attention. She just wanted to feel elegant, as he'd said. Then she saw it. A floor-length gown of deep, midnight blue silk. It had a simple high neckline, long sleeves, and a cut that was modest yet fluid, designed to drape over a woman's form like liquid moonlight. It was sophisticated, serene, and powerful in its understatement. It felt like her, or at least an idealized version of her she wanted to be for one night. With trembling fingers, she selected her size and confirmed the rental. The box arrived 2 days before the gala, a stark black cube sitting on her doorstep that felt entirely out of place in her humble apartment building. Inside, the dress was nestled in layers of tissue paper. The silk was cool and heavy in her hands, more luxurious than anything she had ever touched. She hung it on the back of her bedroom door, where it caught the afternoon light, a shimmering column of blue that was both a promise and a warning. On the evening of the gala, Nicole moved with a focused calm. She showered, letting the hot steam soothe her frayed nerves. She stood before her bathroom mirror, a space of cracked tile and a flickering fluorescent light, and began the slow ritual of transformation. She twisted her natural hair into an elegant coif at the nape of her neck, leaving a few soft tendrils to frame her face. Her makeup was minimal, a touch of foundation to even her velvety skin, a sweep of bronze shadow to make her dark eyes smolder, and a gloss that gave her lips a subtle sheen. She was not creating a new person, but simply polishing the one who was already there. Finally, she slipped into the dress. The silk whispered against her skin, cool and impossibly soft. It fit as though it were made for her, the borrowed silhouette molding to her own. When she looked at her reflection, she saw not Nicole Ellis, the nanny. She saw a woman she barely recognized, poised, graceful, and radiating a quiet confidence she hadn't known she possessed. The doorbell rang at precisely 7 o'clock. Her heart leaped into her throat. Taking one last steadying breath, she opened the door. Leonard was there. He was dressed in a classic black tuxedo, impeccably tailored, as all his clothes were. But the perfection of his attire was not what made her breath catch. It was the look on his face. He had been in the middle of saying something, but the words died on his lips. His mouth was parted slightly, his eyes wide with an unguarded, unadorned awe. He wasn't looking at her as Mr. Whitmore looks at his employee. He was looking at her as a man looks at a woman who has just stolen the very air from his lungs. The silence stretched, thick and charged. He blinked, as if waking from a dream. "Nicole," he finally breathed, her name a soft, reverent sound. "You look—" He shook his head slightly, at a loss for the right word. Stunning felt too small, too common for the vision before him. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice softer than she intended. The formality sounded absurd now, a paper shield against a tidal wave. "Leonard," he corrected her, his voice firm but gentle. "Tonight, please. Call me Leonard." That simple word, his given name, was more intimate than any compliment. It was a threshold. She nodded, unable to speak. He extended his arm, the crisp white cuff of his shirt stark against the black of his suit. She hesitated for only a second before placing her hand in the crook of his elbow. His warmth radiated through the fabric, a steady, solid heat that traveled up her arm and settled deep in her chest. The ride to the museum where the gala was being held was a blur of quiet tension. The interior of his car was all polished wood and soft leather, smelling faintly of him. A clean, expensive scent of sandalwood and bergamot. The city lights streaked past the tinted windows, but Nicole saw none of it. She was acutely aware of the 6 inches of space between them, of the light pressure of her hand on his arm, of the way he seemed to be breathing just a little too carefully. As the car slowed, pulling up to a magnificent stone-faced building, the low hum of the engine was replaced by a new sound, the murmur of a crowd, the staccato flash of cameras. A valet in a smart uniform was already moving to open her door. Leonard turned to her, his expression serious. "Ready?" he asked softly. She looked from his earnest face to the blinding lights waiting just outside the door. She wasn't ready. She was a quiet woman in a borrowed dress, about to step into a world of blinding flashbulbs and inherited wealth. She was terrified, but she looked into his eyes and saw her own nervousness reflected there. And in that shared vulnerability, she found a strange sliver of courage. She gave him a small, trembling smile. The door swung open, and the night rushed in. The world outside the car was a symphony of overwhelming sensations. The sharp, repeated flash of cameras created a disorienting strobe effect, freezing the faces of the crowd into brief, ghostly portraits. The air was cool against Nicole's skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of the car and the heat of Leonard's arm. A low roar of voices, laughter, and distant music washed over them. For a moment, Nicole's instinct was to shrink back into the plush leather seat, back into the safety of the shadows. But Leonard's hand moved from her elbow to the small of her back, a gesture of quiet solidarity. It wasn't possessive, it was grounding, a silent message. "I am here with you." She took that silent offering and stepped out onto the curb. The borrowed silk of her dress swirled around her ankles. She kept her chin high, her gaze focused not on the flashing lights, but on the grand arched entrance of the museum. Leonard was beside her, a calm, solid presence in the chaos. He murmured a few polite words to the photographers, shielding her from the brunt of the attention with his own body, and guided her up the wide marble steps. Inside, the chaos gave way to a cultivated elegance. The museum's main atrium had been transformed. Towering floral arrangements reached toward the vaulted ceiling, from which crystal chandeliers dripped light onto the polished floors. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved silently through the crowd, balancing trays of champagne flutes. The air hummed with the conversations of the city's elite, a low, confident buzz of money and power. Nicole felt a fresh wave of inadequacy. She was a visitor in a foreign land, and she didn't speak the language. Beside her, 7-year-old Hazel clutched her hand, her small fingers a lifeline in this sea of adults. The little girl's eyes were wide, taking in the spectacle with a child's unfiltered wonder and intimidation. "There are so many grown-ups, Nikki," Hazel whispered, pressing closer to Nicole's side. "There are," Nicole whispered back, kneeling down so they were eye to eye, ignoring the multi-million-dollar deals likely being brokered just feet away. "But you're the most important person here. You just stick with me, okay? We're a team." Hazel nodded, a small, brave smile gracing her lips. When Nicole stood up, she found Leonard watching them, his expression soft and unreadable in the dim, golden light. Before he could speak, a portly man with a booming voice and a woman dripping in diamonds descended upon them. "Leonard! Good to see you, my boy!" the man bellowed. It was Sterling Croft, a real estate magnate whose name was plastered on half the new developments in the city. His wife Blythe offered a cool smile, while her eyes performed a swift, practiced appraisal of Nicole, from her simple hairstyle down to the hem of her dress. "Sterling Blythe," Leonard greeted them, his tone polite but reserved. "Good to see you both." "And who is this lovely creature you've been hiding?" Blythe asked, her voice like honey laced with ice. The question hung in the air. Nicole could feel the woman's expectation, waiting for a name she could place, a family she could connect to this glittering world. Leonard's hand tightened ever so slightly on her back. "This is Nicole Ellis," he said, his voice clear and firm. He didn't offer a title or an explanation, just her name as if it were all that was needed. Nicole met Blythe's gaze directly and offered a calm, genuine smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you. Leonard has told me so much about the wonderful work this gala supports. The pediatric wing is so important." Her response was unexpected. She hadn't tried to impress. She hadn't deferred. She hadn't shrunk. She had simply been herself. Blythe Croft looked momentarily disarmed. "Oh, yes, of course. It's a worthy cause." The conversation was brief and superficial, but Nicole had navigated it with an unstudied grace that Leonard found himself marveling at. In an environment where every word was a calculation, her authenticity was a foreign currency, and it was captivating. They moved deeper into the room, Leonard's hand never leaving her back. He introduced her to a few other people, and with each interaction, Nicole felt a fraction of her nervousness melt away. She discovered she didn't need to know about stock portfolios or summering in the Hamptons. When she spoke with the hospital's chief surgeon, they didn't discuss medical breakthroughs. They talked about his granddaughter's love for finger painting. She connected with people on a human level, a plane of existence that was universal, far away from the gilded cage of their status. Leonard watched it all. He saw the way people's expressions would shift when they spoke with her, from polite interest to genuine warmth. They were seeing what he saw every day, the light she carried within her. It wasn't the blinding glare of diamonds or fame. It was a soft, steady glow of empathy and quiet strength. For the first time, he was looking at her freely, unburdened by the roles of employer and employee. He was simply a man, watching the woman he was profoundly drawn to, and feeling a fierce, unfamiliar surge of pride. The most telling moment came when the hospital director, a distinguished older woman named Mrs. Albright, came to greet them. She naturally cooed over Hazel, who immediately hid her face in the folds of Nicole's blue dress. "Well, aren't you a shy one?" Mrs. Albright said kindly. Leonard opened his mouth to apologize for his daughter's reticence, but Nicole was already handling it. She didn't scold Hazel or force her to be polite. Instead, she kept a reassuring hand on Hazel's back and spoke to the director. "Hazel is a wonderful observer," Nicole said smoothly, her voice a gentle comfort. "She likes to take everything in before she decides to participate. It's one of her greatest strengths." The director's smile widened, this time with genuine admiration. A very wise quality to have. The interaction was over in a minute, but for Leonard it was a revelation. He saw it all with piercing clarity. Nicole hadn't just made his daughter feel safe, she had honored her nature. She had defended and reframed his daughter's shyness as a strength. In that small, quiet moment, he understood that Nicole's presence in their lives was not a service he paid for. It was a gift. Soon, a familiar, kind-faced woman, Mrs. Gable, the family's trusted driver, appeared at the edge of the crowd. It was time for Hazel to go home. Nicole knelt once more, hugging the little girl tightly. "You were so brave," she whispered into Hazel's hair. "I'm so proud of you." "Bye, Nicky. Bye, Daddy," Hazel said, her duty done, and she happily took Mrs. Gable's hand and disappeared into the crowd. A new silence fell between Nicole and Leonard. The air had shifted. Her official reason for being there, her shield, was gone. Now she was just a woman in a blue dress, standing beside a man in a tuxedo, alone together. He turned to her, and the warmth in his eyes made her stomach swoop. The background noise of the gala seemed to fade into a distant hum. "Thank you, Nicole," he said, his voice low and intimate. He wasn't looking at the crowd or the chandeliers. He was looking right at her, and she felt seen in a way that was more profound than the gaze of 100 strangers. For everything. He offered a small, almost boyish smile. "Now that your official duties are concluded," he said, the words chosen with deliberate care, "may I get you a glass of champagne?" The question was a bridge. With a single, trembling nod, Nicole chose to cross it. "Yes, Leonard," she said, the sound of his first name on her lips feeling both foreign and strangely right. "I'd love one." He gave her a smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners in a way she had never seen before. It transformed his usually severe, handsome face into something open and boyishly charming. The shift was so profound it made her heart skip a beat. As he guided her toward the bar, she was acutely aware of the other women in the room. She saw their gazes trail Leonard's path, saw the flicker of interest, the calculated smiles aimed in his direction, and she saw, with a growing sense of wonder, how he noticed none of them. His focus was a tangible thing, a warm, protective bubble around the two of them. With 2 flutes of bubbling, pale gold liquid in hand, he led her away from the throng, toward a set of glass doors that opened onto a stone balcony. The cool night air was a welcome relief. Below, the city sprawled out in a breathtaking tapestry of glittering lights. For a few moments, they stood in a comfortable silence, the distant sounds of the city and the party behind them forming a strange, intimate soundtrack. "So," he began, turning to lean against the balustrade beside her, "what's the real verdict on all of this?" He gestured vaguely with his glass toward the opulent party inside. Nicole considered her answer, appreciating that he was asking for her truth, not for polite platitudes. "It's like watching a play where everyone knows their lines," she said softly. "It's beautiful and it's for a wonderful cause, but I'm not sure how much is real." She took a delicate sip of her champagne. I think the truest thing I've seen all night was the way Hazel's face lit up when she saw the dessert table. He let out a short, genuine laugh. It was a wonderful sound, low and rich. You're right. That was definitely real. His smile faded into something more pensive. I've been coming to these things for years. I think you're the first person who's ever been honest with me about them. He looked at her, his gaze intense. You're honest about everything, aren't you? The question caught her off guard. I try to be. I remember you mentioned once when you were first hired that you have a degree in literature, he said, his voice casual, but the detail was not. He had remembered a stray comment from nearly a year ago. What was the plan then? Before this? He gestured again, but this time he meant her life, her job. The question opened a door inside her she usually kept closed. The plan was to teach, she admitted, her voice a little wistful. High school English. I wanted to be the teacher who made kids fall in love with books, who showed them that stories could save them. She looked out at the city lights. But life has a way of editing your best-laid plans. My mother got sick, and I needed a job with more flexibility and better pay than a first-year teacher's salary. I took a nanny position temporarily and I was good at it. One temporary job led to another, and here I am. She didn't say it with regret, but with a quiet acceptance. This was her story. Leonard listened, his expression never changing. He didn't offer pity or platitudes. He just heard her. There's no shame in a story that changes, he said finally, his voice soft. My father wanted me to be a lawyer, to take over his firm. I spent a year in law school absolutely miserable before I found the courage to tell him I wanted to build things, not argue about them. It was a small piece of himself, offered in return for hers, a perfectly balanced exchange. A cool breeze swept across the balcony, and Nicole shivered, the thin silk of the dress offering little protection. Before she could even register the cold, Leonard was shrugging out of his tuxedo jacket. Here, he said, draping it carefully over her shoulders. The jacket was heavy, enveloping her in his scent, and a lingering warmth that had nothing to do with the fabric. It was an act of pure, unthinking care. His fingers brushed her shoulders as he adjusted it, and a jolt of electricity shot through her. She clutched the lapels, the fine wool a tangible link between them. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. He just nodded, his eyes holding hers, and in that moment, the entire world shrank to the space of that balcony. The noise of the party, the city below, it all faded away. There was only the weight of his jacket on her shoulders and the unspoken truth hanging in the air between them. The spell was broken by a sharp feminine voice. Leonard, darling, I've been searching everywhere for you. A woman emerged from the doorway, gliding toward them with the predatory grace of a panther. She was tall and slender, dressed in a crimson gown that demanded attention. Her blonde hair was swept into a chignon so perfect it looked sculpted, and her smile was sharp and bright. Nicole recognized her from society pages, Cassandra Vance, an heiress to a hotel fortune. Cassandra, Leonard said, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly, a subtle layer of armor sliding back into place. It's been an eternity, Cassandra purred, placing a hand on Leonard's arm, a gesture of casual ownership. Her eyes flicked to Nicole, taking in the borrowed dress and, most pointedly, the tuxedo jacket draped over her shoulders. The polite smile on her face didn't reach her eyes. And you are? She asked, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. The question was not an invitation, but a challenge, a demand for credentials Nicole did not have. Nicole felt the warmth from the jacket turn into a burning heat of self-consciousness. She was an outsider, marked by the kindness of a man this woman clearly felt belonged to her. She opened her mouth to give her name, to somehow explain her presence, but Leonard spoke first. He didn't move away from Cassandra's touch, but he shifted his stance slightly, turning his body more fully toward Nicole. He then placed his hand gently on her back, over his own jacket, a clear, unambiguous gesture of alignment. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, steady, and left no room for interpretation. Cassandra, this is Nicole Ellis. He paused, letting the name settle in the cool night air, before delivering the final, decisive blow. She's with me. Cassandra Vance's perfectly sculpted smile tightened by a fraction of a millimeter, but the shift was as seismic as a crack in marble. Her gaze, sharp and analytical, flickered from Leonard's resolute face to Nicole's. For a heartbeat, Nicole felt like a specimen under a microscope, being examined for flaws. The weight of Leonard's hand on her back was the only thing keeping her anchored. It was a silent, powerful declaration that had reverberated across the small stone balcony. and its echo was now settling in the space between the three of them. Nicole Ellis, Cassandra repeated the name, her tone smooth as silk, but there was a new, hard edge to it. She tilted her head, a gesture that was meant to look thoughtful but felt predatory. How interesting. I feel I know everyone who matters on the city's philanthropic circuit, but I can't seem to place your name. Do you work with one of the hospital foundations? It was a trap elegantly laid, a question designed to categorize and, if necessary, dismiss. Nicole felt a surge of adrenaline. This was a test. She could stammer. She could over-explain her role in Leonard's life. She could try to justify her presence here, or she could do none of those things. She remembered Leonard's words, "She's with me," and drew strength from them. She met Cassandra's probing gaze without flinching and allowed a small, serene smile to touch her lips. "No, I don't," she said, her voice quiet but firm, carrying easily in the cool night air. She offered no more information. Then she took the power of Leonard's declaration and made it her own. "I'm here with Leonard." The simple sentence, a direct echo of his own, landed with finality. It was a checkmate. There was nowhere for Cassandra to go from there without appearing openly rude. The polite smile on the heiress's face finally faltered, replaced by a cool mask of indifference. She had lost the exchange and she knew it. "Well," Cassandra said, turning her attention back to Leonard, her voice a little too bright. "How you must be sure to introduce me to your new friends more often, darling." The emphasis on new was a final parting shot. "Do find me for a dance later." And with a swish of crimson silk, she was gone, disappearing back into the glittering party. The moment she vanished, the tense energy on the balcony deflated, leaving a different kind of tension in its wake, something more fragile and intensely personal. Nicole became hyper-aware of Leonard's hand still resting on her back, the warmth of it seeping through his jacket. He let out a slow breath. "I apologize for that," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Cassandra and I have a long history. She tends to see things in terms of ownership." Nicole looked up at him, at his earnest, almost pained expression. "You don't have to apologize for her," she said softly. Then she allowed herself a moment of raw honesty. "But thank you." His eyes searched hers. "For what?" "For what you said," she whispered. "For not letting her make me feel small." A deep, unspoken understanding passed between them. The encounter had been a trial by fire, and instead of pushing them apart, it had forged a new, stronger alloy between them. The party inside, with its clinking glasses and calculated laughter, now seemed distant and irrelevant. "I've seen enough of this world for one night," Leonard said, his gaze never leaving hers. "Haven't you?" She gave him a grateful smile. "More than enough." The decision to leave was a silent pact. They were choosing their own quiet reality over the loud, performative one inside. They walked back through the atrium, Leonard's jacket still securely around Nicole's shoulders, his hand once again a comforting presence on her back. He nodded politely to a few acquaintances, but he didn't stop, his purpose clear. He was getting her out of there. He was taking her home. The car ride back was saturated with a new kind of silence. It wasn't the hesitant, anticipatory silence of the ride there. This was a silence heavy with meaning, with the weight of everything that had happened and everything that hadn't been said. Nicole stared out the window at the blurred city lights, her fingers tracing the textured lapel of his jacket. It smelled of him, of sandalwood and safety. He drove with a relaxed focus, his handsome profile illuminated by the passing streetlights. The tension of the evening seemed to have melted out of him, replaced by a quiet contentment. "So," he said, breaking the silence as they waited at a red light. His voice was soft, pulling her from her reverie. "If you were the teacher, the one who makes kids fall in love with books, what's the first one you would have put on the syllabus?" The question was so unexpected, so completely removed from the world of Cassandra Vance and fundraising galas, that it made her smile. He was bringing them back to the balcony, back to the two of them, just two people sharing their stories. "The Outsiders," she answered without hesitation. "By S.E. Hinton." "Why that one?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Because it's about finding your family in the people who choose you, not just the ones you're born to. It's about realizing that everyone, no matter what side of the tracks they're from, sees the same sunset." He was quiet for a long moment, absorbing her words. The light turned green. "I think you would have been a great teacher, Nicole." When he pulled up in front of her modest brick apartment building, the contrast with the night's earlier grandeur was stark. The magic of the evening was meeting the pavement of reality. He didn't just pull over. He turned off the engine, plunging the car into an absolute, intimate silence. He got out and walked around to her side, opening her door before she had a chance to reach for the handle. He walked her to the front door of her building, then up the 2 flights of stairs to her apartment. The hallway was dimly lit and smelled of old carpet and whatever her neighbors were cooking. It was a world away from the marble and chandeliers, but Leonard didn't seem to notice or care. He stopped in front of her door, the number 2B painted slightly crookedly on the wood. The moment felt suspended in time. A good-night handshake would be an insult to the intimacy they had shared. A kiss felt like a leap across a chasm that had only just been bridged. He just stood there looking at her, his eyes full of a raw, unguarded emotion that made her forget how to breathe. "I haven't felt this clear-headed in a very long time, Nicole," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It was a confession, vulnerable, real, and devastatingly honest. He raised a hand, and for a terrifying, thrilling second, she thought he was going to touch her face. Instead, his fingers brushed lightly against the lapel of his own jacket that she still wore. "Good night," he murmured, and then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing softly down the stairwell. Nicole stood frozen, her hand flying to her lips as she watched him go. She fumbled for her keys, let herself into her apartment, and leaned heavily against the closed door. She was still wearing his jacket. The night was over, but she knew with every fiber of her being that something was just beginning. The first thing Nicole saw when she woke was the jacket. It was lying carefully draped over the back of her only comfortable armchair, a slash of expensive, dark wool against the pale, worn fabric. It looked like a creature from another world, a relic from a dream she wasn't sure had been real. She slid out of bed and walked toward it, her bare feet silent on the cool wood floor. She reached out and touched the lapel, the texture solid and real under her fingertips. A faint, lingering scent of sandalwood and Leonard rose from the fabric, and the entire, overwhelming night came rushing back. His eyes when she opened the door, the weight of his hand on her back, his voice on the balcony cutting through Cassandra's venom. "She's with me." And his final words at her door, a confession that had left her breathless. A wave of hopeful, terrifying vertigo washed over her. What did this morning mean? Last night she was a woman in a borrowed dress, living a fairy tale. Today she was a nanny on her way to work, back in the stark light of reality. How could she possibly face him? Would he be the formal, reserved Mr. Whitmore again, pretending nothing had happened? The thought sent a chill of dread through her. The ambiguity was worse than anything. She carefully folded the jacket, placed it in a protective garment bag, and got ready for work. The routine was the same: shower, coffee, toast, but nothing felt the same. Every mundane action was charged with a nervous energy. The bus ride through the city's awakening streets, a journey she had made hundreds of times, felt different today. She wasn't just going to her job. She was heading toward a question that had no easy answer. When she arrived, she let herself in with her key as usual. The house was quiet, too quiet. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She walked toward the kitchen, holding the garment bag like a peace offering, and stopped in the doorway. He was there. He was standing at the counter, not in a crisp suit, but in a simple grey long-sleeved shirt and dark jeans. He looked younger, softer, more approachable than she had ever seen him. He was pouring hot water over coffee grounds in a drip cone, the familiar, rich aroma filling the air. He heard her and looked up. For a second they just stood there, the space between them humming with the unspoken memories of the night before. His eyes were warm, and there was no trace of the guarded formality she had feared. "Good morning, Nicole," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "Good morning, Leonard," she replied, the name feeling more natural on her tongue this time. She held up the garment bag. "I brought your jacket. Thank you." He set down the kettle and walked toward her, taking the bag from her hands. Their fingers brushed a brief electric touch that sent a shiver up her arm. "Thank you for last night," he said, his gaze direct and sincere. "I hope it wasn't too overwhelming." "It was," she started, searching for the right word. "It was a beautiful evening." "Good," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I meant what I said, Nicole. At your door." The directness of his confirmation was a relief so profound, it almost made her knees weak. He wasn't retreating. He wasn't pretending. This was real. Before she could respond, a small whirlwind of pink pajamas and messy hair came barreling into the room. "Nikki, you're here!" Hazel launched herself at Nicole, wrapping her arms around her legs. Nicole laughed, the tension inside her finally breaking. She leaned down and hugged the little girl. "I'm here, sweet pea, and I'm starving." Are you going to help me make pancakes? Yes, Hazel cheered. What happened next was a subtle seismic shift in the tectonic plates of their lives. Instead of retreating to his office with his coffee, Leonard leaned against the counter and watched them. And when Nicole set a plate of pancakes on the island for Hazel, he pulled up a stool. "Those smell too good to pass up," he said, grabbing a fork. So they ate breakfast together, the three of them, at the kitchen island, with the morning sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It felt shockingly domestic, normal. Nicole was hyper-aware of him beside her, of the easy way he laughed when Hazel got syrup on her nose, of the way his shoulder would occasionally brush against hers. It felt so right that it was terrifying. This was how a family felt. "Hazel has been begging me to take her to the new interactive exhibit at the Science Museum," Leonard said, breaking a comfortable silence. He looked from his daughter to Nicole, his expression open and a little hesitant. "I was planning to take her this Saturday. I was wondering if you would want to come with us." The question was simple, but its implications were vast. This wasn't a gala with a professional pretext. This was a Saturday, a family outing. He wasn't asking her to work. He was asking her to join them, to be a part of their weekend, their life. It was a step across the final blurry line. A joyful yes was on the tip of her tongue. The image of the three of them, laughing among dinosaur bones and star projectors, was so lovely it made her heart ache. "I'd love that," she said, her voice filled with a warmth that was impossible to hide. Hazel clapped her hands in delight. Leonard's face broke into a wide, genuinely happy grin. For a perfect sun-drenched moment, the future felt simple and bright. And then his phone buzzed on the countertop. The sound was jarringly loud in the happy quiet. He glanced at the screen, and the change in his demeanor was instantaneous. The warmth drained from his face, replaced by a guarded, familiar tension. The open, approachable man from moments ago vanished, and Mr. Whitmore, the man with secrets and sorrows, reappeared. "Excuse me," he said, his voice clipped. "I have to take this." He picked up the phone and walked out of the kitchen, his back ramrod straight. Nicole's gaze fell to the countertop where the phone had been. In the split second before the screen went dark, she saw the caller ID. The name seemed to burn itself into her memory, stark and formal against the cheerful, sunlit kitchen. Eleanor Whitmore. Who was Eleanor? His mother? A sister? The name sounded cold, powerful, and historical. Nicole looked at Leonard's retreating back, then at Hazel, who was happily oblivious, drawing a smiley face in a puddle of syrup. A new, cold knot of dread began to form in the pit of her stomach. The path forward, which had seemed so clear and bright just a moment ago, was suddenly obscured by a new and unknown storm cloud. The joyful, sun-drenched atmosphere in the kitchen evaporated the moment Leonard walked out. It was as if he'd taken all the light and warmth with him, leaving behind a cold, anxious silence. Hazel, still happily smearing syrup on her plate, was oblivious, but Nicole felt the shift like a drop in barometric pressure, a warning of a coming storm. She moved on autopilot, clearing the plates, her movements stiff and mechanical. She rinsed the dishes under the hot spray of the faucet, the sound of the running water, a poor mask for the strained, low murmur of Leonard's voice coming from his office down the hall. She couldn't make out the words, only the cadence. It was clipped, tense, and utterly devoid of the easy warmth he had shown her just minutes before. She heard a few sharp, staccato responses, followed by long, heavy pauses. This was not a pleasant chat. This was a confrontation, or a surrender. She couldn't tell which was worse. When he returned 10 minutes later, he was a different man. The soft, grey shirt was the same, but the man inside it had changed back into a former version of himself. The walls were up, impenetrable and high. His shoulders were tense. His jaw was set, and his eyes, when they briefly flickered toward her, were clouded over, the emotional shutters drawn tight. "My apologies," he said, his voice the formal, distant tone of Mr. Whitmore. "A family matter required my attention." He offered no other explanation. He walked to the coffee pot, poured the rest of the brew into his mug, and turned toward his office without another word. Nicole stood frozen, watching as he walked down the hall. The soft click of his office door shutting echoed in the cavernous kitchen. It was a sound of finality, a closing off. Every ounce of the fragile, hopeful progress they had made that morning seemed to have been locked away behind that door. The rest of the day was a study in distance. Leonard remained sequestered in his office. At lunchtime, Nicole prepared a simple tray with a sandwich and a glass of water, leaving it on the small console table outside his door, just as she had in her first few months of working here. It felt like a regression, a painful step backward. The tray was retrieved silently, and the empty plates returned an hour later without a word. Nicole poured all her energy into Hazel, a desperate attempt to ignore the growing knot of dread in her stomach. They built a towering castle of blocks in the living room, its colorful turrets a cheerful affront to the house's somber mood. They read 3 books in a row, curled up on the oversized sofa, Hazel's warm, small body a comforting weight against her side. But through it all, Nicole's mind was elsewhere. Her gaze kept drifting to the closed office door. Doubt, cold and sharp, began to creep in. Who was Eleanor Whitmore? A mother, an aunt? A sister-in-law, perhaps, who felt she had a claim to his grief? Was this woman the gatekeeper to his life, and had Nicole just been identified as an intruder? She thought of the museum trip on Saturday. Would it still happen, or was it just a fleeting idea spoken in a moment of sun-drenched weakness, now erased by the harsh reality of this phone call? The precariousness of her position had never been clearer. She was the nanny. She had no right to ask questions. She had no right to comfort him. All she could do was wait, and the waiting was agony. Later that afternoon, the ever-punctual Mrs. Gable arrived to take Hazel to her weekly piano lesson. The older woman, with her kind eyes and air of quiet competence, had been with the Whitmore family for over a decade. She saw everything. As Nicole was helping Hazel into her coat, Mrs. Gable gave her a knowing, sympathetic look. "Long day, dear?" she asked softly, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. Nicole just gave a tight, weary smile. Mrs. Gable nodded toward the closed office door. "He gets like that sometimes," she said, her voice dropping even lower. "Her dark mood comes over him like a fog, especially when she calls." The confirmation sent a chill through Nicole. So it was a pattern. "She?" Nicole asked, feigning ignorance. "His mother-in-law," Mrs. Gable clarified in a hushed tone. "Eleanor, a formidable woman, thinks she knows what's best for everyone, especially him and the little one. You just keep your head high, dear. The fog always lifts." The information settled in Nicole's gut like a stone. His late wife's mother. It made a painful, complicated kind of sense. Eleanor wasn't just family. She was a living link to his grief, to the woman he had lost. By the time evening fell and Hazel was tucked into bed, Nicole knew she couldn't leave things as they were. She couldn't endure another day of this crushing ambiguity. Taking a deep breath and gathering a courage she didn't know she possessed, she walked to his office and knocked softly on the door. A muffled, "Come in," was the reply. She pushed the door open. The room was cast in shadow, the only light coming from the architectural lamp on his desk, which illuminated a vast blueprint he was staring at but not seeing. He looked up as she entered, his face etched with exhaustion. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "It's no disturbance," he said, his tone weary. She decided to take the direct path, because any other would be dishonest. She couldn't ask about his mother-in-law, but she could ask about them. "Leonard," she said, her hands twisting together in front of her. "About Saturday, the museum." She let her voice trail off, the unspoken question hanging in the dim, quiet room. "Is it still happening? Are we still happening?" He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time since that morning phone call, the guarded mask slipped. She saw not the formidable architect or the grieving widower, but a man who looked tired, pained, and incredibly lonely. "Yes," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Of course it is." Relief washed over her so intensely she felt dizzy. He pushed his chair back and stood up, walking around the desk until he was standing just a few feet from her. "In fact," he said, his eyes burning with a new, fierce intensity she didn't understand, "after today, I think it's more important than ever." Leonard's words echoed in Nicole's mind on her bus ride home, a strange and potent cocktail of reassurance and foreboding. More important than ever. The museum trip was no longer a simple outing. It had been imbued with a new significance. It was a line being drawn in the sand, a quiet act of defiance aimed at a woman she had never met. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. She was no longer just an observer in his life, she was becoming a participant in his silent battles. The next 2 days at the house were a delicate dance of unspoken understanding. The heavy fog of tension had lifted, but a lingering haze remained. Leonard was preoccupied, often lost in thought, but he was no longer distant. The opposite, in fact. He seemed to be making a conscious effort to bridge the space between them. He'd appear in the kitchen while she was making Hazel's lunch and lean against the counter, asking her about her day with a focused interest he rarely showed before. He started leaving his office door ajar, and more than once, She would look up from a book she was reading to Hazel and find him watching them from the doorway, a complex expression on his face, a mixture of warmth, sadness, and a fierce, protective resolve. Nicole found her feelings for him solidifying, crystallizing into something deeper than attraction. It was empathy. She saw the weight he carried, the lonely burden of being a single father, the pressure from a formidable mother-in-law, and the ghost of a grief that still shadowed the corners of his life, and she saw the strength with which he was trying to find the light. When Saturday morning arrived, the air was bright and clear with anticipation. Leonard picked her up from her apartment, a gesture that felt both gentlemanly and deeply personal. He wasn't in a suit, but in well-worn jeans and a soft forest green sweater that made his eyes look warmer. He wasn't Mr. Whitmore, the millionaire architect. He was Leonard, a father taking his daughter, and her, out for the day. The car ride was a world away from the tense, silent journeys to and from the gala. Hazel, buckled in her car seat in the back, was a happy, chattering narrator for the trip, pointing out every dog, bus, and interesting cloud. Her innocent joy was infectious, filling the car and creating a space for Leonard and Nicole to relax into an easy, comfortable rapport, laughing at Hazel's endless stream of questions. For the first time, it didn't feel like a boss and his nanny. It felt like a family. The museum was a cavern of wonders. In the vast hall of dinosaurs, Hazel stood with her head craned back, her mouth a perfect O of awe, before the towering skeleton of a Tyrannosaurus rex. Leonard, the architect emerging, began explaining the structural genius of the fossil's assembly, but his eyes kept flicking to Nicole. He wasn't watching the dinosaur. He was watching her watch his daughter, his expression softening as he saw the genuine delight on her face. In the interactive science exhibit, all pretense of formality melted away. They became a team, working together to build a magnetic marble run. Leonard's long, clever fingers figured out the engineering, while Nicole's patient hands guided Hazel's. Their hands brushed as they reached for the same piece, a jolt of simple, domestic electricity passing between them. Their laughter echoed in the noisy, chaotic room, a pure, uncomplicated sound. The true shift came in the planetarium. In the cool, enveloping darkness, they sat side by side, with Hazel nestled between them. As the projector whirred to life, painting the domed ceiling with a breathtaking sprawl of stars and nebulae, the universe expanded above them. Hazel let out a soft gasp. In the anonymity of the dark, shielded from the eyes of the world, Leonard moved. Slowly, deliberately, he reached across the space separating their armrests, his hand finding hers. It wasn't a tentative touch. His fingers laced through hers, a firm, quiet gesture of possession and belonging. It was a silent statement, more powerful than any words spoken in the light. Nicole's heart stuttered. She curled her fingers around his, holding on tight. In the artificial twilight, surrounded by distant, dying stars, something new and vital was being born between them. Later, as they were getting ice cream at the crowded museum cafe, a woman from Hazel's school approached their table. "Leonard, hi," she said with a friendly, unassuming smile. "It's Jenna from Hazel's class." She beamed at Nicole. "And you must be Nicole. Hazel talks about you non-stop. It's so wonderful to finally put a face to the name." Nicole braced herself for the awkward explanation, the social dance, but Leonard handled it with a simple, elegant grace. "Jenna, it's good to see you," he said warmly. "Yes, this is Nicole." He gestured to the three of them, a small, inclusive motion. "We're all just enjoying a day out together." "We're." The word was so simple, so profound. He hadn't defined her as the nanny or a date. He had defined them as a unit, a we. Jenna accepted it without a second thought, chatted for another minute about an upcoming school event, and then waved goodbye. The interaction was blessedly, beautifully normal. The day ended in a haze of happy exhaustion. They left the museum as the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the pavement. Hazel was sleepy, her steps dragging, her hand held securely in Nicole's. The feeling between Leonard and Nicole was one of quiet triumph. They had done it. They had spent a day living in the shape of a family, and it had fit them perfectly. As they walked toward the parking garage, Leonard's phone buzzed in his pocket. The sound was a harsh intrusion, a sour note in their perfect symphony. He stopped walking, pulling the phone out. Nicole watched his face as he read the screen. She saw the color drain from it, the easy happiness of the day wiped clean away, replaced by a stark, pale dread. The fog was rolling back in, swift and chilling. "Leonard?" she asked. her voice small. "Is everything okay?" He looked up from the phone, his eyes wide with a new urgent panic. He seemed unable to speak. Wordlessly, he turned the phone and showed her the screen. It was a text message. The sender was listed as Eleanor Whitmore. The message itself was only a few devastating lines. "Flight lands at noon tomorrow. I'm staying for the week. We need to have a serious discussion about what's best for Hazel's future." The glowing phone screen was a gaping wound in the twilight. The happy, sun-warmed bubble they had lived in all day didn't just pop, it shattered, the sharp edges of reality tearing through their fragile peace. Leonard snatched the phone back as if it had burned him, his face a pale mask of dread. Nicole felt the blood drain from her own face, a cold wave of fear washing over her. Eleanor Whitmore, a name that had until now been a phantom, a whisper of trouble. Now she was an airplane ticket, a ticking clock. The drive back to Nicole's apartment was a journey through a vacuum. Hazel, exhausted from the day's excitement, had fallen asleep in the back seat, her soft breaths the only sound in the car. It was a stark contrast to the ride there. The silence was thick and suffocating, composed of 1,000 unspoken fears. Leonard gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He was driving on pure muscle memory, his mind clearly a million miles away, locked in a war room planning for an invasion. Nicole sat in the passenger seat, feeling more like an outsider than ever before. The warmth of his hand holding hers in the planetarium felt like a memory from another lifetime. She wanted to reach out, to place a hand on his arm, to say something comforting. But what could she say? She had no standing here. This was a family crisis, a history she was not a part of. The chasm between them, which had seemed to vanish during the day, had reappeared wider and deeper than ever. When he pulled up to her building, he cut the engine, but he didn't get out. He just sat there for a long moment, the silence pressing in on them. "I'm sorry, Nicole," he finally said, his voice a low, strained whisper. He wouldn't look at her. He just stared through the windshield at the familiar brick of her apartment building. "Today was perfect, and I let this ruin it." "You didn't let it," she said softly. "It just happened. I have to handle this," he said, and the words, though meant to be practical, felt like a dismissal. It was his problem to handle, alone. He was already building the walls back up, not to shut her out, but to protect her from the shrapnel. She understood it, but it still hurt. "I know," she said. She got out of the car before he could, closing the door with a soft click. He watched her walk to her building's entrance, his face a portrait of helpless agony, and then he drove away, taking their perfect day with him. Alone in her apartment, the four walls felt like they were closing in. Leonard's jacket, which she had carefully hung in her closet, seemed to mock her from behind the door. The borrowed luxury, the fleeting fantasy, fear, cold and insidious, began to whisper in her ear. Was it all a dream, a temporary respite from his real life? She was the sunny day companion, the gentle nanny who was good for outings and pancakes, but she was no match for a woman like Eleanor Whitmore. She pictured her, elegant, steely, a woman who moved through the world with the unshakable certainty that she was in charge. A woman who would look at Nicole and see not the person who had brought laughter back into her granddaughter's life, but an obstacle, an inappropriate, emotionally entangled employee who needed to be removed. Nicole's own quiet strength felt like a flickering candle against the hurricane of this woman's perceived power. Worse than the fear was the guilt. Had she pushed this? Had she crossed a line that should never have been crossed? By allowing herself to feel for him, to step into his life, had she inadvertently invited this chaos? The thought that she could be the cause of more pain for him and Hazel was unbearable. A desperate, self-sacrificing thought began to form. Maybe the kindest, most professional thing she could do was to disappear, to resign, to remove herself from the equation and make it easier for him to handle this. The idea left a bitter, metallic taste of ash in her mouth. Miles away, in his silent, glass-walled house, Leonard was living his own nightmare. After checking on a peacefully sleeping Hazel, he went to his office, but he couldn't work. He paced the floor like a caged animal. Eleanor's impending arrival was a physical weight on his chest. He thought of past phone calls, of her subtle, cutting criticisms disguised as concern after his wife passed. Her suggestions that he wasn't grieving properly, that he was letting Hazel run wild, that the house wasn't being managed correctly. She saw him not as a grown man, but as a broken boy who had failed to protect her daughter and now needed her iron-willed guidance to raise the next generation. He knew what she would say about Nicole. She would call it a distraction, a dereliction of his duty to his late wife's memory. He stopped in front of his desk and looked at a framed photo of him and his wife, smiling on a beach. He missed her with an ache that had never truly faded, but his love for her was a part of his history, a room in his heart he would always cherish. Nicole wasn't a replacement. She was a new wing, a place where light and air could get in again, a place where he could breathe, a place where Hazel could flourish. He thought of Hazel's laughter in the museum. He thought of Nicole's hand in his, a silent anchor in the dark. He looked at his wife's photo again and imagined her reaction. She had been a woman full of life and light. She would have wanted him to be happy. She would have wanted her daughter to be happy. The choice became brutally clear. To appease Eleanor would be to sacrifice the first real chance at a happy future he and Hazel had found. It would be an act of cowardice. He had to fight, not just for himself, but for his daughter. For Nicole, for the fragile, beautiful we they had started to build. It was nearly 11 o'clock when the frantic knocking came. Nicole, who had been curled on her sofa staring at a blank TV screen, jumped. Her heart hammered in her chest. Who would be at her door this late? With trembling hands, she crept to the door and looked through the peephole. It was Leonard. He looked undone. His hair was messy, as if he'd been running his hands through it for hours. He wasn't wearing a jacket, just the green sweater from their day out, and he looked both exhausted and electrified, his eyes burning with a desperate, resolute fire. She unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. He stood there, breathing heavily, the cool night air swirling in around him. He didn't wait for an invitation. The words tumbled out of him, raw and urgent, a plea from a man standing on the edge of a cliff. "Tomorrow, I have to face her," he said, his voice ragged. "But I can't do it if I think I'm going to lose you, too. Tell me you're not going to disappear on me, Nicole, please." He stood on her doorstep, like a man confessing a crime, his plea hanging in the air between them, raw and desperate. "Tell me you're not going to disappear on me." It was the question that lay beneath all her own fears, the one she had been asking herself all night. In his eyes, she saw her own terror reflected, but she also saw a flicker of hope he had placed entirely in her hands. In that moment, her own self-doubt, her own impulse to run and hide, felt like a selfish, cowardly thing. He wasn't asking her to fight his battle. He was asking her to hold his hand while he fought it himself. She took a step back, pulling the door wider in a silent invitation. "Leonard," she said, her voice soft but unwavering, a steady anchor in his storm. "I'm not going anywhere." Relief washed over his face so profoundly that he seemed to sag against the doorframe. She reached out, took his hand, and gently pulled him inside her small, warm apartment. It was the first time he had ever been in her space, a world of second-hand books, thriving plants, and a life built on resilience, not wealth. The air was thick with unspoken emotion. "Sit down," she said, leading him to the worn sofa. "Can I make you some tea?" He just nodded, sinking into the cushions and burying his face in his hands. She went to the kitchen, her movements calm and purposeful. While the kettle heated, she watched him. He looked like a man carrying the weight of two worlds on his shoulders. When she returned with 2 steaming mugs, he had straightened up, his eyes weary but clear. "She arrives at noon tomorrow," he said, his voice flat, "at the house." Nicole sat beside him, leaving a respectful but supportive space between them. "What do you want to do?" "What I want to do is check you and Hazel onto the first flight to somewhere warm and quiet and deal with this alone," he admitted with a wry, tired smile. "But that's not the answer. The answer is to stop hiding." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "I want you there tomorrow, Nicole, at the house, not as a nanny taking care of Hazel, as you, as the person who is with me. I don't want to hide you, I don't want to hide us. I want her to see the truth of our life right from the start." It was the riskiest strategy imaginable. It was also the most honest. "Okay," she said simply. "I'll be there." The next day, the Whitmore house felt like a stage, perfectly set for a drama. The air was still, clean, and humming with a nervous, electric tension. Nicole arrived mid-morning, dressed in simple trousers and a soft, cream-colored sweater. She was not in uniform. She was herself. Leonard met her at the door, taking both her hands in his. He looked as though he hadn't slept, but his grip was firm, his resolve solid. "Thank you for coming," he whispered. Hazel, sensing the strange gravity in the air, was quiet and clingy, refusing to leave Nicole's side. The 3 of them were in the bright, open-plan living room when the sound of the front door opening sent a jolt through the house. Eleanor Whitmore was not a monster. She was worse. She was a woman of impeccable taste, quiet authority, and a grief she wore like a shield of armor. She was tall and slender, with her late daughter's dark eyes and a mouth set in a permanent line of polite disapproval. She greeted a tense Leonard with a cool kiss on the cheek. "Leonard, you look exhausted," she said. It was a statement, not a question. Her eyes found Hazel, and a genuine, if possessive, warmth softened her features. "There's my darling girl." She knelt, opening her arms. Hazel hesitated, looking to Nicole for permission before slowly going to her grandmother. Eleanor then stood, her gaze finally landing on Nicole, who stood quietly by the fireplace. She scanned Nicole from head to toe, her expression unreadable but deeply unsettling. "This is a difficult time for the family, Miss Ellis," Eleanor said, her voice calm and clipped. "I'm sure you understand. Perhaps you could allow us some privacy." She was dismissing her. The first shot had been fired. Before Nicole could even form a response, Leonard stepped forward, moving to stand slightly in front of her. A subtle, protective shift. "No," he said. The word was quiet, but it landed with the force of a gavel. "Nicole is staying." Eleanor's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose a fraction. "I beg your pardon?" "I said she is staying," Leonard repeated, his voice gaining a strength Nicole had never heard before. He was no longer the grieving son-in-law. He was the man of this house. "Because this is her life too. She is family." "Family?" Eleanor's short, sharp laugh was a shard of ice. "Leonard, she is an employee, a nanny, a very temporary figure in your daughter's life. I am here to discuss Hazel's long-term stability, her future. It requires a clear head, not a romantic distraction." "A distraction?" Leonard took a deep breath, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Eleanor, look around you. This house was a mausoleum for 2 years, a silent grey tomb. I was a ghost and my daughter was a shadow. Nicole is the person who came into this house and painted it with color again. She is the reason my daughter laughs, the reason she feels safe. She is the reason I feel human again." He took a step toward his mother-in-law, his voice dropping, but gaining an intensity that was formidable. "You want to talk about your daughter's legacy. Her legacy is that little girl, a child who deserves to be surrounded by joy and warmth, not by the ghosts of the past. Nicole brought that joy back. If you're really concerned about Hazel's future, then you should be thanking her." He turned then and looked at Nicole, his heart in his eyes. The whole world seemed to narrow to the space between them. "I am not distracted, Eleanor. I am awake for the first time in years, and I am choosing my future. I am choosing her." He faced his mother-in-law again, his final words delivered with a quiet, unshakable finality. "You are welcome in this house as Hazel's grandmother. I want you in her life, but you are not the master of it. We are a family, me, Hazel, and Nicole. That is not negotiable. If you cannot accept that, then you will be the one who is a temporary figure in our lives." Eleanor Whitmore stood in stunned, absolute silence. Her face was pale, her composure finally cracked. She had come here expecting to fight a boy. She had found a man. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Without another word, she turned and walked stiffly toward the guest suite, defeated. The moment the door closed behind her, the immense tension in the room snapped. Leonard let out a shuddering breath, the adrenaline leaving him shaky. He turned to Nicole, his eyes wild with fear and hope and love. "Leonard," she breathed, her own eyes filled with tears. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "I meant every word," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, and then he kissed her. It was not the tentative, questioning kiss of a new romance. It was a kiss of profound, soul-deep recognition. It was the kiss of a man coming home, of a woman who had found where she belonged. It was a kiss that sealed a promise, a victory, and a future, not as a boss and a nanny, but as 2 whole, complete people who had finally found their way to each other. A year and a half later, the first thing one noticed about the house was the sound. The heavy, curated silence that Nicole had once worked so hard to fill was a distant memory, a ghost of a former life. It had been replaced by the rich, chaotic, and beautiful symphony of a home. It was the sound of a 9-year-old's laughter echoing down the hall, the low thrum of a classic soul station playing from a speaker in the kitchen, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of Hazel practicing her dribbling on the back patio, and the easy, overlapping conversation of 2 people deeply in love. On a bright Saturday morning in late spring, Nicole was curled on the living room sofa, her feet tucked under her, a cup of coffee warming her hands. She was reading a novel, but her attention was mostly on the scene across the room. Leonard, wearing a flour-dusted apron over a faded t-shirt, was at the stove, flipping pancakes with a theatrical flair that made Hazel giggle with delight. He was no longer a man living in the shadows of his own life. He was a man fully inhabiting it, his movements light, his smile easy and frequent. The house itself had changed. A vibrant, slightly messy finger painting by Hazel was held by a magnet to the door of the Sub-Zero refrigerator. A well-loved, slightly battered copy of the Chronicles of Narnia sat on the polished marble coffee table, right next to one of Leonard's formidable architectural digests. The sterile perfection had given way to the comfortable, lived-in clutter of happiness. This was no longer a monument to what was lost. It was a vibrant, breathing testament to what had been found. Leonard slid a plate of perfectly golden pancakes in front of his daughter at the island. "For the Queen of the Castle," he declared with a mock bow. "Thank you, Papa," Hazel said, before looking over at Nicole. "Nikki, are you going to have some?" "In a minute, sweet pea," Nicole smiled. "I'm waiting for the master chef to serve me personally." Leonard laughed, a warm, genuine sound that still made Nicole's heart flutter. He brought a plate over to her, stealing a quick, soft kiss as he set it down. "Your wish is my command." She watched as he returned to the kitchen, ruffling Hazel's hair as he passed. The ease between them, the casual, unspoken affection, was a quiet miracle she never took for granted. Later, while Hazel was in the backyard, chasing butterflies with a net, Leonard came and sat beside Nicole on the sofa. He slipped his arm around her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, falling into the familiar, perfect fit of his embrace. They sat in a comfortable silence for a while, just watching their daughter through the vast glass wall. "Do you ever think about that first gala?" he asked softly, his voice a low rumble against her ear. She smiled into his shoulder. "Sometimes. I remember a ridiculously nervous man in a tuxedo, trying to pretend he only invited me for his daughter's sake." He chuckled, tightening his grip. "I was terrified, utterly. Not of the crowd or the speeches. I was terrified you would say no, that you'd see right through my flimsy excuse, and I'd lose my chance before it even started. It felt like my entire future was balanced on that one question." "My future, too," she whispered. "I just didn't know it yet." The doorbell chimed, and Hazel's excited shriek followed. "Grandma's here." She dropped her butterfly net and bolted for the door. Eleanor Whitmore stood on the threshold, but she was not the same woman who had arrived like a storm a year and a half ago. The rigid posture had softened. The cool, judgmental shield in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, watchful peace. She smiled, a real warm smile, as Hazel threw her arms around her waist. "Hello, darling girl," she said, kissing the top of Hazel's head. She looked up and met Leonard's gaze, and then Nicole's, with a look of calm acceptance. In her hands she held a beautifully wrapped gift. "For you, Nicole," she said, handing it over. "I saw it in a rare bookshop and thought of you." Nicole unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a worn, leather-bound first edition of Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, one of her favorite authors. It was a gesture of breathtaking thoughtfulness. It was an apology, an acceptance, and an embrace, all in one. "Eleanor, it's beautiful," Nicole said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." The war was long over. What remained was the slow, patient work of building a new kind of peace, a new kind of family. Later, the three adults stood by the window, watching Hazel show her grandmother the small vegetable patch she and Nicole had planted. Leonard's hand rested on the small of Nicole's back, a simple, constant touch that was his own language of love. He had learned that love wasn't about grand, dramatic pronouncements. It was about the steady, daily choice to show up, to be present, to make pancakes on a Saturday morning. Nicole leaned into him, her heart full. She still, sometimes, remembered the woman who had arrived at this house so long ago, a woman who knew her place and was terrified to step outside of it. She remembered the profound, heavy silence, but the memory was a ghost now, a faint echo from a distant life, easily banished by the bright, beautiful, chaotic sound of home. And if it were up to you, sir, would you have made the same choice? Your participation in the channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.